This is the Bible Book Club.
And we're so excited to be in one of my favorite books, the Book of Ruth.
Welcome to the club. If you have just found us, welcome to the Bible Book Club, Season 8, the Book of Ruth. If you're new, we call this podcast the Bible Book Club because the Bible is the #1 selling book of all time. It must be read, and it is fascinating to discuss. We make it easy to do both here at the Bible Book Club. We read and discuss. You just download and listen wherever you are while you drive, work out, fold the laundry, whatever you do. We're here with you.
Nice. So the Bible is a collection of small stories that tell a much larger story. The larger story is the entire history of our redemption with Jesus as the ultimate hero. The Book of Ruth is one of the smallest stories in this big book, the Bible. But we're going to see how this small book contributes to the great story of how God's love and kindness are providentially at work in all things to restore and redeem us for eternity. All right, so let's cover all the basic logistics of Ruth. The author of Ruth, no one knows for sure, but Jewish tradition holds that Samuel wrote the book. Now, the structure of the Book of Ruth is fascinating. It is chiastic, which means that the content of the book is symmetrical in structure, not easy to do. The first part relates to the last part. The second part relates to the second to the last, and so on, with the middle section being a highlight. And there's several chiastic sections within the book. It's a pattern used often in the Bible, and we've talked about this before in other seasons. But it is way too complicated in the Book of Ruth in a podcast because you just get lost in all the different patterns. But for those who love literary patterns and really appreciate the genius of authors who write like this, you can Google it and have fun discovering just how beautifully this story was crafted. So what messages or themes are there in the Book of Ruth? There are 3 really good ones. One message is about Hesed. It's a Hebrew word spelled H-E-S-E-D. And simply, it means love and loyalty, but it really means a lot more. We're going to talk about it. But it is fundamental to God's plan for us. The second theme that you want to be looking for is providence. Because of God's Hesed, love and loyalty, for us, He is always at work in the world, even in the midst of suffering and loss. And this work in the world has a purpose to redeem us, which leads us to the third message, which is redemption on an individual and global level, which has been God's plan from the very beginning in Genesis. The Book of Ruth's iconic verse is 1:16.
Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God.
I'm sure you're all familiar with this because they do use it a lot at weddings, even though in the Book of Ruth it has nothing to do with weddings. All right, summary. The Book of Ruth is the story of how God providentially moves behind the scenes to redeem individuals while at the same time weaving them into the greater story of redemption for the world. The bottom line is that this book is a story of redemption and a multi-dimensional story of hope. For anyone in our audience who's like Naomi and has suffered and feels abandoned by God. For anyone who's like Ruth, who feels like a stranger to God, unsure of why God would choose to use them. And for anyone like Boaz, who feels the call to do something for the Lord that will be life-changing and risky. This is a story of hope. It is a reminder that God is always with us, even in our darkest moments, and that He can use even the most difficult circumstances to bring about His plan. Okay, so how does Ruth fit into history and into the Bible? The place and time of Ruth is as follows. Ruth takes place in Bethlehem over 1,000 years before the advent of Jesus' birth. Now, this was during the dark period of Judges, which we covered in the last season of Bible Book Club, but they overlap. And most likely, Ruth took place during the 80 years of peace under the second major judge, Ehud, the left-handed judge. I will put a link in the show notes to the Bible Book Club timeline so you can see where this book falls in the history. I will also put a link to the list of the 12 judges chart to kind of jog your memory if you were with us last season. Okay, so this was the darkest period in Israel's history. Remember from the book of Judges. Why? What was the problem? You'll recall from season 7 that the book of Judges ended with these words.
In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit.
So in the days when Judges ruled, the problem was that everyone did as they saw fit because Israel had no king. The message in Judges is that Israel needs a king, a savior. The message in Ruth is that the king is on the way. This time period in Israel's history may have been dark, but the story of Ruth is anything but dark. It cuts through Judges with the hope of God's promise. So we have a Bible bender gift for you. The book of Ruth is creatively also a Christmas story. So for season 8, the 4 episodes of Ruth will have an Advent edition episode, a bonus episode, if you will. So look for it right after this one. Now, these episodes, bonus episode 1, 2, 3, and 4, will be shorter episodes. They will be an Advent extra because the story of Ruth is an Advent story. And spoiler alert, the solution to the Israelites' problem, the need for a king, is announced at the end of Ruth. The promised seed will be born in Bethlehem in the book of Ruth, which leads to the promised king born in Bethlehem in the book of Samuel, which leads to the promised savior born in Bethlehem in Matthew and Luke. There is so much meaning to a little town of Bethlehem, and it starts here. So let's begin our journey into the book of Ruth, starting with episode 1, Sweet Naomi's Bitter Return. Scene 1 is from Bethlehem to Moab and back.
Chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelek. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there.
Okay, so the first thing we want to notice is that Israel is a product of the times, and so is Elimelek. The order of everything is upside down. The fields of Moab, outside of the Promised Land, are productive, but inside the Promised Land in Bethlehem, there is a famine. Chapter 1 opens in Moab. The Moabites are related to the Israelites. They descended from Lot, Abraham's nephew. Now, Lot and Abraham were traveling together way back in Genesis, but they separated, and Lot chose to settle at Sodom, which was not a good choice and led to a sad life, because much later, Lot had incest with his daughter, which produced a son named Moab, and eventually the Moabite people. The Moabites created a lot of trouble for the Israelites, leading them into idolatry in Numbers 22 through 25. Remember Balaam and the donkey and Phinehas the killer priest? You can see season 4, episodes 12 and 13 for that story. The fact that an Israelite family would choose to move from the Promised Land to Moab is a blatant sign of disloyalty to God. Elimelek, like many Israelites of the day, lacked the faith to trust God. But God's going to use it. Now, the ironies of this situation are several. Naomi and her husband and their 2 sons moved to Moab from Bethlehem because there was a famine in Israel, which is very ironic because Bethlehem means house of bread, but the house of bread cannot produce wheat, resulting in a breadless house. Keep in mind that bread is also a symbol for Christ, who said in John 3:6,
Then Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty.
So eventually, Jesus, the bread of life, will be born in the house of bread, which at one time could not produce wheat. Very ironic. Another irony is that Elimelek his name means, my God is king, which dovetails with the final verse of the book of Judges that says that in those days, Israel had no king. But if God had been Elimelek's king, like his name implied, he would have trusted God to provide for him in the promised land instead of leaving it.
Continuing then in verse 3. Now, Elimelek, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there.
This is tragic. While living in Moab, Naomi's husband dies and both sons die, but not before they married Moabite women. Marrying outside of the faith was prohibited and may not have happened if they had not left Bethlehem. Both marriages lasted 10 years but produced no children. The covenantal implications are clear here. God promised the land and the people promised to obey, but they didn't obey. So to turn them back to dependence on him, God withheld the rain in Bethlehem and there was no food. Elimelek and his family tried to escape the famine, but God withheld fertility and there was no child. It was a famine of another kind. Now Naomi is in a personal famine. She is living alone in grief and suffering in a foreign land, surrounded by people who worship false gods, and she is without any means to support herself as she grows old. Naomi learns that the famine in Israel is over, and in her emptiness, she longs to return to her people and her God. Verse 6 said that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food. This verse and only one other at the end of the book of Ruth are the only 2 verses that are attributed to God in the entire book. The 2 verses are bookends to the book of Ruth. In verse 6, God provides food. And in chapter 4, verse 13, God provides a child. The verse says, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a child. Recall that Ruth was not able to conceive for all the years she was married to Mahlon. Both the harvest and the child, the harvest in Bethlehem and the child, were provisions of a seed. You see the analogy here? And in chapter 4, verse 13, at the end of Ruth, we haven't gotten there yet, we'll get there in 3 episodes, God provides a child. And the seed of the child will lead to the promised seed from Genesis that will save the world, that we also know as the bread and life, Jesus Christ. In between these 2 verses, that bookend 4 chapters of Ruth, God will be silently, providentially working behind the scenes to orchestrate his will. Naomi makes a decision to leave Moab, and this is a turning point. Naomi is making a decision to return to Israel, to her God. She is leaving Moab for the house of bread in the promised land, which is a note to us. You are living in the world. Every day you must consciously decide to turn from the world to the bread of life, Jesus. You're either going forward toward him or backward away. Something to think about in everything we do. All right, scene 2, choices on the road. Now, Naomi is a woman who deeply suffered. We have to remember that. Anything she says or does, keep that point of view in your mind. She faced starvation in her homeland and left friends and family to find food because her husband probably was the one that made that decision. She went along with it. In a strange land, living as a foreigner, she lost her husband and became a widow. Then both of her sons married outside the Israelite families. They married Moabites. And with her boys settling into the culture, that must have been hard for her to watch. Is she losing hope of ever returning to Israel? Maybe. Then she loses both of her sons, and neither one of them had conceived. So she had no grandchildren, which was super important to elderly people at that time. Now, Naomi has no children, no grandchildren, and as a result, no provision for her future. Naomi, we will see, has lost hope. She is returning to Israel empty and bereft. And we're going to read that she wants to be called Mara, which means bitter, rather than Naomi, which means pleasant or sweet. Yet, before her present state, of being bitter, Naomi must have been very sweet indeed, because she does not have a typical daughter-in-law relationship. Orpah and Ruth are very devoted to her. They're so devoted, they're willing to leave everything they have known ever in their life to travel to a foreign land with her and without any male protection for like a week-long journey. What these women have been through together, the three of them, has made them more dependent on each other than on their Moabite families. This sweet scene of love and concern for others is a stark contrast to the relationships we read about in season 7 of the book of Judges.
Verse 7. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to 2 sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this, they wept aloud again.
So picture this. Naomi bravely sets out for Bethlehem with her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, along the road. And she's probably thinking the whole time she's walking, but along the road, she pauses. She's bitter, but realistic about what awaits them as poor Moabite outcasts and widows in Bethlehem. As dangerous and lonely as it will be for Naomi to go alone, it just doesn't make sense for these girls to go with her. Her life will be miserable. They are so young. Why should they be miserable too? She is old. So she advises them to return, and she blesses them in the hope that they will find joy with another husband from their own people. But the girls weep at the thought. They do not want to leave sweet Naomi, even though Naomi thinks she's bitter. The love and grief of this little sorority of women is heartbreaking. And this love and loyalty to each other is the first small example of hesed, a dominant theme in the book of Ruth. Now let's dig into this concept of hesed. It's complex. In fact, whole books have been written about it. The Hebrew word hesed appears about 250 times in the Old Testament. You've never seen it, though, because it's always translated kindness. Unfortunately, it's a word that no one English word can convey accurately, and that is why that was just put kindness. Hesed is a type of love that is much more than kindness and includes loyalty, generosity, goodness, mercy, and compassion. It is usually based on a relationship that had a prior history, and it usually requires an action. It is usually performed by a more powerful person for a weaker person, and it is usually a voluntary act of extraordinary mercy or generosity. In summary, hesed refers to an act performed for the benefit of a person in real and desperate need, in the context of a deep and enduring commitment between the 2 parties. Most of the Bible references of hesed describe a loving act of God to man. Genesis 19 uses the word hesed when God sends angels to rescue Lot. In Genesis 32, Jacob, fearing Esau for his life, asked God for hesed. But there are examples of how we are to show hesed. In Joshua 2, Rahab shows hesed to the spies and asks for hesed in return. But some of the best examples of hesed are found in this book that we're reading. In verse 8, Naomi is showing hesed by sending the girls back, and she prays to God for him to show hesed to Orpah and Ruth. Both those in that verse, both times it was mentioned, it's called kindness, but it's really hesed. It's much deeper. Now, Ruth demonstrates hesed for her mother-in-law by caring for Naomi and providing for her in chapter 2. In chapter 3, Boaz will demonstrate hesed as a man of God caring for the 2 widows and as a kinsman redeemer. But listen closely. for the signs of the greatest giver of Hesed at work throughout the book of Ruth, because God is providentially always on the move to redeem His people. And in the final chapter of Ruth, in that little town of Bethlehem, in a dark time over 1,000 years before the greatest gift of Hesed was given to all mankind, another seed was planted right here in the book of Ruth. This book is an amazing Advent story. And if you'd like to ponder it in anticipation of Christmas, Bible Book Club has a 4-week Advent extra to go with the 4 chapters of Ruth. Now back to the girls on the road.
Continuing on in verse 14, then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her.
Orpah chooses to return to her family. Now, this is a culturally fitting decision. Her legal tie to Naomi is dissolved, her husband is gone, and they had not produced a child with any claim to the promised land. However, the decision to return was not a spiritually wise decision. As close as she was to Naomi, it does not appear that she grew close to Naomi's God. Orpah returns not only to her people, but to their gods, the gods of Moab. In contrast, Ruth chooses to stick. Ruth's loyalty goes beyond cultural expectations. And this is another turning point. She will not leave Naomi, and the family will disintegrate no further. She pledges our theme verse,
where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God.
So Ruth's pledge here, or oath, that Naomi's people and God will be hers, is likened to a covenant for life. Similarly to Genesis 2:24, where it says, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, Ruth pledges to cling to Naomi for life. Ruth has turned. Her words are considered a profession of faith. She has forsaken the gods of Moab for the one true God. Through faith and covenant, she has become part of God's people, and she will not leave the woman who is her only relational tie to the God of Israel. In a world where a woman sought value and fulfillment through marriage and childbirth, Ruth's devotion to Naomi was an act of Hesed, because her chance for marriage in Moab was far greater than her chance for marriage in Israel. Or so we think at this point. Little does Naomi know about God's providential plans for Ruth. So here's a Bible bender, it was for me at least, from the book of Genesis for those who've been with us since the beginning. There are many allusions to the book of Genesis in the book of Ruth. Most of them we will discuss in chapter 4. But there is an allusion here that points back to Genesis 13 and 19. So Lot, remember, was Abraham's nephew, both descendants of Haran. He was Abraham's father and Lot's grandfather. As they traveled, both became prosperous, and Abraham suggested they separate. This did not end up being a good idea for Lot, as I explained earlier. He chose to live in Sodom, a corrupt culture. It had a terrible effect on his family. In the end, his wife became a pillar of salt. He and his daughters lived in fear in a cave. His daughters got him drunk so they could have children, and the incest resulted in the Moabite people. Ruth, remember, is a Moabite. Similarly to Abraham, as Naomi and Ruth travel, Naomi suggests they separate, like Abraham did. But unlike Lot, Ruth refuses. Ruth's refusal to be separated marks a reunion of the lines of Lot and Abraham, which were separated in Genesis. And spoiler alert, through Ruth, The line of Lot is grafted into the line of the promised seed to save the world.
That is a Bible bender for sure, and certainly an example of God's grace.
Yes, he brought them back in just like he brings us in. It's so cool. All right, scene 3, the bitter return.
Verse 19. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?"
Gosh, you could read that last question happy or judgmental. So we're going to talk about it. Bethlehem, it's thought, was a very small town at this point. Everyone knew everyone. And travelers were probably few. So when a caravan came to town, and we kind of can assume the 3 girls didn't travel alone, that they kind of joined a caravan somewhere. But everyone probably came out with curiosity, especially nosy women who want a break from washing or whatever they did back then. So when they came to their doors, because the kids were running around going, "The caravan's down, the caravan's down," did they look upon her with judgment or joy? Was Naomi so changed, haggard, poor, grief-stricken, alone, accompanied only by one foreign girl rather than a husband and 2 sons? Naomi must have heard the whispers, because she commands them.
Verse 20, "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me."
Naomi's bitterness is public. She is not sweet anymore. So call her Mara. And the blame is on God. He has afflicted her. At least, though, Naomi got to choose her new name. Poor Ruth may have adopted God and Israel as her own, but they have not adopted her yet. She is a foreigner, and her name, with an added label, makes it very clear to the entire town. She is called Ruth the Moabite.
Verse 22. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning.
Okay, the barley harvest was beginning. Tender little hint of hope here. Naomi left Bethlehem in famine and returned right at the harvest. Now, this is the answer to a promise from Deuteronomy 30 that says this:
"When all these blessings and curses I have set before you come on you, and you take them to heart wherever the Lord your God disperses you among the nations, and when you and your children return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and with all your soul, according to everything I command you today, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you and gather you again from all the nations where he scattered you."
The contrasts in Naomi's life are so blatant. From Bethlehem to Moab, she went from sweet to bitter, full to empty, life to the death of her entire family. But Naomi has returned, and Naomi will be restored. Not just geographically to Bethlehem. Naomi doesn't know it yet, but she is returning spiritually. And though she is bitter, God will compassionately restore her. She will start out empty, but as the harvest progresses, she will be restored, filled with the goodness of the Lord, physically and spiritually, body and soul. Because the book of Ruth is a story about Hesed, providence and redemptions. God will show Naomi his Hesed, and he will work providentially, and her life will be redeemed. How has God shown you Hesed? How has he worked providentially in your life? And do you find joy in the knowledge that you have been redeemed? Are you lonely, hopeless, or suffering like Naomi? If so, stay with us. The book of Ruth is a gift of God's Hesed for you.
What's a club without friends? If you're enjoying the Bible Book Club, why don't you share it? And then you can say, "Welcome to the club." New episodes drop every Monday, and get all episodes now on Amazon Music. As always, head over to susanme.com/Bible Book Club for show notes from today's episode. Bible Book Club is hosted by Susan Merrill and Heather Rubio, edited by Buck Buchanan, produced by Haley Mawat.